and there was no cut in total spending. And one last comment before I take your question. The reason politicians can say they cut the budget when they say there's a shortfall is because year over year they have a projection. They say, well, we had, for example, $51.8 billion is what we spent last year. 28.2 was the budget. In 2010, the current year we're in, they want to spend more than that. So if they wanted to spend $30 billion, but they could only do 28, they would say they had a $2 billion cut to make it fit in there. Now, think about that. That's not really a cut. It's a cut from what they wanted to do. It's not a cut from reality. So,
how much of that budget comes from federal sources as opposed to state sources?
There was like $8 billion roughly Medicaid. Most of that is obviously federal. And there are other lump sums. And then we had stimulus money last year of a few $1 billion. So each year is a little bit different. In fact, you can thank the federal government for helping us make sure it was that big last year. So what that means is we're now going to be addicted to that spending because we've hired people based on that spending.
So then the next question is, supposedly because we have such a great delegation in Washington capturing federal funds, how does this compare to other states in terms of the percentage of budget that we're actually...
I don't know. I know that certain states like Arizona and New Mexico have a much higher percentage of federal money because they've got a lot of prison industry related things and highways that are federally funded. The lower population states often tend to have a much higher percentage of federal workers and federal monies coming in. Massachusetts is probably somewhere right in the middle. We're not at the top. We are number one, by the way, in long-term debt per capita in the country.
With two others on the ballot, well, how would you differentiate yourself?
The two other Republicans that are running for auditor both have an accounting background. And the one thing that is important for you to understand is that the state auditor, first of all, is not an auditor. The state auditor is an executive leadership role. There's over 300 people that work in the auditor's office. More importantly, government auditing and financial auditing are completely different animals. And it's easy for people to hear the term auditor. They think, well, I want a CPA or I want an accountant type. But I've already researched this. I actually spoke with an old boss of mine who worked at Ernst & Young for 24 years. I called him up. I said, hey Alan, financial auditing, government auditing, he's like totally different things. He's actually going to be writing a statement of endorsement for me, even though he worked at Ernst & Young for all those years. But that being said, I actually had 20 minutes to sit down with the current auditor, with Joe DiNucci, on Monday morning. And he and his director of communications both said the same thing. They said, yeah, the financial audits are handled by a completely different part of the government. We don't do that. So it really is about, basically, they look at every agency and every vendor, and they look for waste, fraud, and abuse. That's their number one mission. They're really kind of going through and making sure that, all right, you sent us 10 boxes of whatever, let's make sure we got 10 boxes of whatever. The last thing that the auditor gets to do is to have certain insight and ruling power on privatization under the Pacheco law. So people can kind of roll things up and say, we'd like to outsource this government function. And the auditor can look at things and go, you know what, I don't think this is good for the people of the Commonwealth either, because it'll be more expensive or because we'll lose control or whatever it might be. So that's really, that is, and I don't mean to diminish the value of financial auditing. That's a very important function. It's just not what the state auditor does. I'm also the only candidate out of the 3 Democrats or Republicans who is working on transparency. I'm the only one that's got that angle. That's a pledge I'm making. I'm also the only one who's pledging to only run for 2 terms. I'm only going to hold office for 2 terms. I'm not going to take a public pension. I don't think politicians should have pensions. And I'm giving myself a 10% pay cut on the first day because it has to start at the top. Those are things that we do in the private sector. I'm sure most of you have probably experienced that in the private sector to some degree, right? How many of you have pensions anymore in the private sector? My father did, back in the 70s. I haven't seen it since then. These things are gone, and we can't afford this anymore in our state government. We can't afford, that's not sustainable. We're going to lose a congressional district after this upcoming election. We're losing people pretty fast. Who's going to pay for all of it? So, we have 537 agencies in the state that operate within 112 different divisions and departments, employing over 83,000 full-time employees. It's a lot of government that just keeps growing, and we need to have a way to control that. And it's clear that the legislators on Beacon Hill aren't going to do it. They've proven it. The governor's not going to do it. And this has continued, I don't want to just cast stones only at the Democrats, because I hate to say it, but there have been Republicans involved in this growth as well. And we have to realize that when you're on Beacon Hill, one of the things that happens is the only people you hear from are people who want things, right? How many politicians get to hear from people who don't want it? If you don't want anything, you don't generally call your politician unless maybe you're some of us activists who call up and say, please stop spending the money we don't have. That's really about it. But most of the time, it's very difficult. Wow. This is a great group. So I'm happy to wrap up. Or if there's any more questions.
And you can take some
No?
more after the meeting.
Okay. Well, thank you.